They humiliated her, blamed her for nothing, and threw her out of an elite car dealership, thinking she was just an ordinary visitor. Everything was done quietly, confidently, and by the rules. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Watch till the end, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you would do in her place and where you're watching from. Ronda Rousey made the decision quietly, without ceremony or witnesses, in the kind of moment that did not feel important at first and only later revealed its weight. It was not anger that led her there, nor curiosity in its shallow form, but something older and heavier, the accumulated awareness of how differently the world behaved when it believed it knew who you were. She had spent years moving through spaces where her name arrived before she did, where doors opened early and smiles appeared on command. Compliments came pre-packaged. Service was flawless. Mistakes were forgiven instantly. It was a comfortable reality, but one that had begun to feel dishonest, too polished, too rehearsed. She wanted to see what existed underneath it. That morning she chose simplicity with deliberate care. No branded clothing, no statement pieces, nothing that would invite recognition. Her clothes were ordinary to the point of invisibility, clean but unremarkable, chosen to blend rather than define. Her hair was tied back plainly, her face untouched by makeup meant for cameras. She carried no entourage, no assistants hovering at a polite distance, no visible markers of status. Her phone stayed silent in her pocket, not raised, not used, not even glanced at more than necessary. She set rules for herself before stepping out of her car. Remain calm, remain polite, do not provoke, do not escalate. Observe. That was all she intended to do. The elite car dealership stood exactly where it was supposed to, a monument to restraint and wealth disguised as minimalism. Glass walls stretched cleanly across the facade, reflecting the city in softened lines, while inside, controlled lighting gave the vehicles a quiet authority. Everything about the building suggested discretion, power, and exclusion, without ever needing to say so aloud. Ronda paused for a moment before entering, not out of hesitation, but to take in the place as it presented itself to the outside world. It was not intimidating by design, yet it communicated clearly who it believed belonged within. As she stepped inside, the air shifted. The scent of polished leather and metal blended with something faintly chemical and expensive, a smell that spoke of constant maintenance. The floor gleamed beneath her feet, each step soundless, absorbed by surfaces meant to impress without calling attention to themselves. Several cars stood on display, positioned with precision, angled just enough to invite admiration while discouraging casual touch. A handful of customers moved slowly through the space, their posture relaxed, their presence unquestioned. Staff members stood at strategic points, attentive but not eager, their eyes scanning the room in practice patterns. Ronda felt the moment of assessment before she fully registered it. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet unmistakable once recognized. A glance lingered too briefly to be polite and too long to be accidental. A consultant near the center of the showroom noticed her entry and then looked away without moving to greet her. Another staff member shifted position slightly, turning his body toward a different customer while keeping her in his peripheral vision. No one approached. No one acknowledged her presence in any meaningful way. She was inside the building, but already placed somewhere outside its intended flow. She walked slowly, allowing herself to move as any ordinary visitor might, reading small plaques beside the vehicles, pausing to examine interiors without touching them. She followed every unspoken rule of the space, careful not to give even the smallest reason for suspicion or correction. As she moved, she became aware of the contrast unfolding around her. A well-dressed man entered a few minutes later and was greeted almost immediately, his arrival met with a smile and a polite nod. Another customer, already inside, received attentive explanations, the consultant leaning in slightly, speaking with visible enthusiasm. The difference was not dramatic, it was precise, calculated. It was absence rather than presence, neglect rather than hostility. Ronda waited. She allowed time to pass, giving the benefit of doubt to coincidence, to busyness, to chance. She told herself that someone would approach eventually, that this was not personal, that the system might correct itself if she simply remained patient. Yet as minutes stretched longer, the pattern sharpened. Consultants passed near her without making eye contact. Conversations happened within arm's reach, but never included her. She existed as a silhouette, a shape that did not demand acknowledgement. Inside her, irritation stirred, but she kept it contained. She reminded herself why she had come. This was the test, not whether someone would insult her outright, but whether indifference itself could function as a form of dismissal. She observed the staff as much as the cars, noting how quickly judgments seemed to form, how effortlessly attention was allocated elsewhere. There was a rhythm to it, a silent agreement among employees about where their energy should be spent and where it should not. Eventually, she made the smallest attempt to enter the system. She approached a central desk, standing close enough to be noticed without interrupting anyone. She waited until a consultant finished speaking with another customer and then remained there, calm, open, available. The consultant glanced at her briefly, then turned away to check something on a tablet. Another staff member walked past and offered a polite nod that ended before it began, an acknowledgement stripped of substance. Rhonda felt something tighten in her chest, not anger, but recognition. This was not an oversight, it was a decision. She moved again, drifting toward a specific model she had researched beforehand. She read every detail, tracing the information with her eyes, absorbing specifications she already knew. She imagined herself as any other person who might genuinely be there to purchase, someone without influence or public identity, someone for whom this interaction would determine whether they felt welcome or dismissed. The thought settled heavily. If this were her only reality, if this were how she was always treated, how often would she choose to leave rather than insist on being seen? Around her, the dealership continued its quiet choreography. Laughter surfaced briefly from a conversation nearby, then faded. Shoes clicked softly against the floor. Glass reflected movement without distortion. Everything functioned smoothly, except for her inclusion within it. She began to understand that exclusion did not always require confrontation. Sometimes it was enough to simply not respond. As she stood there, a consultant glanced in her direction again, exchanged a look with a colleague, and then turned his attention elsewhere. That exchange lasted no more than a second, but it carried meaning. Decisions were being made without her participation. The dealership had categorized her, sorted her, and moved on. She felt the first true shift inside herself then, the quiet acknowledgement that this visit would not end neutrally. Something had already been set in motion. She did not leave. Instead, she remained where she was, grounded, steady, allowing the environment to continue revealing itself. She felt the weight of being unseen press against her, not as humiliation yet, but as a prelude to it. The silence around her was not empty. It was charged. And as she stood there, observing the effortless confidence with which the system ignored her, she sensed that the next step would not be accidental. It would be intentional. By the time she finally caught the faint movement of someone heading toward a manager's office, glancing back in her direction, Rhonda understood that her presence had begun to register as something else entirely. No longer merely invisible, she was becoming inconvenient. The air in the showroom felt subtly different now, tighter, more alert. She remained calm, unaware that this quiet moment of waiting was the last she would experience before the situation began to turn against her. The test had begun, and the dealership had already chosen its answer. The moment after a place decides you do not belong, there is rarely loud. It does not arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrives the way coldness arrives in a room. Gradually, almost politely, until you realize your skin has begun to tighten and your breath has changed without your permission. Rhonda remained where she was, still and composed, and allowed the dealership to continue revealing itself. She had come to observe, and now the observation had turned from vague discomfort into something sharper, something with edges. At first, the neglect had been easy to excuse. A busy day, a consultant finishing with another customer. A simple mistake. But as minutes became longer than reasonable, the pattern began to feel deliberate, like a silent rule that applied only to her. She moved through the showroom with patient restraint, reading plaques she could have recited from memory, studying the lines of a vehicle she had already seen in photographs. She did it not to occupy herself, but to maintain a posture that could not be criticized. Every motion was controlled. Every pause was calm. She refused to give them an excuse that would justify what they were already doing. It was then that she noticed how the ignoring operated as its own kind of language. A consultant would drift toward her, slow down as if preparing to acknowledge her, then redirect his steps toward someone else at the last moment. Another would pass close enough that she could smell the faint cologne on his collar, yet his gaze would slide right past her face as if she were part of the furniture. When she stepped nearer to the central counter again, positioning herself where any customer would reasonably be met, the staff responded with small evasions. A tablet would suddenly require attention. A folder would need to be moved. A quick glance would be offered and then withdrawn before it could become a greeting. Around her, service continued with smooth competence. A well-dressed couple received attentive care, the consultant leaning in slightly, guiding them from one car to the next, pointing out details with the easy confidence of someone who assumed their time would be rewarded. Another customer, older and clearly wealthy, was offered refreshments without having to ask. None of it was dramatic enough to be called discrimination in a courtroom. Not yet. It was simply a steady flow of preference, a quiet sorting of who mattered and who did not. Rhonda could almost feel herself being carried toward the edges of the room by the force of their indifference. And then there were the moments that carried something more than neglect. They were small, the kind of moments people later tried to describe as misunderstandings. A consultant's mouth curling briefly, not into a smile, but into something that suggested amusement. A glance at her shoes, quick and dismissive, followed by a subtle shake of the head. A murmured exchange between two employees that ended with a stifled laugh as she approached within range. None of it was spoken directly to her, which was part of the design. It gave them cover. It allowed them to claim innocence. But the message arrived anyway, fully formed, and it landed where it was meant to land. Rhonda had trained her entire life to regulate impulse. In fighting, discipline was survival. Outside it, discipline was often mistaken for weakness. She felt her jaw tighten, but she loosened it again. She felt heat rise in her chest, but she kept her breathing even. She reminded herself that this was the point. If she reacted like a person in pain, they would label her unstable. If she remained calm, they would grow bolder. Either way, the truth would show itself. She approached a display vehicle whose price placed it firmly in the dealership's highest tier. The car was positioned like an altar, angled under light that made the paint appear deeper than it should have been, as if the color itself had been engineered to imply privilege. Rhonda stayed an appropriate distance and examined the information card. She let her eyes trace the specifications and options with the seriousness of someone prepared to make a decision. Then, without rushing, she looked around for an available consultant, not with desperation, but with the simple expectation of service. One stood nearby speaking to a colleague. When Rhonda's gaze met his, he looked away at once. He turned slightly, placing his shoulder between them, and continued his conversation as if she had never existed. The feeling that followed was not just irritation. It was a kind of clarity. There was no longer room for doubt. The dealership was not failing to notice her. It was choosing not to recognize her. She had become an unwanted customer, and the refusal was part of their internal order. She decided to engage more directly, still within her own rules. She walked toward the main counter, waited until a staff member finished a task, and then positioned herself in a way that could not be ignored without effort. She did not wave. She did not call out. She simply stood there, calm, visible, patient. It was remarkable how quickly people could become busy when confronted with a customer they did not want. The staff member's posture shifted. His gaze flicked to her face, then to somewhere over her shoulder, then down to his hands. He picked up an object he did not need, adjusted it, and set it down again. Another employee drifted closer, glanced at her, then turned away with the faintest expression of annoyance, as if her presence itself were an imposition. Rhonda waited long enough that the delay became absurd. The air around her felt strangely loud in its quiet, filled with the soft hum of lights and the muffled movements of bodies trying not to engage. She made a slight movement toward the desk, a gentle signal that she was ready to be assisted. The nearest staff member finally shifted, not to help, but to create distance. He stepped away under the pretense of checking something in the showroom, leaving her alone at the counter again. The longer it continued, the more she understood what it did to a person. It was not just service being withheld. It was dignity being eroded by silence. A normal customer in her position might begin to question their own legitimacy, might soften their posture, lower their voice, apologize for existing. The dealership relied on that. It relied on people leaving before conflict could be named. Rhonda refused to leave. She walked the showroom again, slower this time, as if she were considering several options. She paused near a sales brochure stand and lifted one carefully, only to return it to its place with the same care. The action was harmless, but she noticed a subtle change in the staff's attention. One consultant watched her hands too closely. Another moved a step nearer, his body angled in a way that suggested surveillance rather than service. It was as if the idea of her touching anything in the showroom had awakened a different category in their minds. Not customer, not even nuisance. Something between suspicion and threat. She felt it shifting, the way a room shifts when people begin to agree on a narrative. She could almost sense the silent conversation spreading through glances and small gestures. A consultant's eyebrows lifting, a colleague's mouth tightening, a quick look toward the office area at the back, where management would be. They were constructing a story about her without needing her participation, and once that story was established, it would be used to justify what they did next. Rhonda chose a specific model again, a vehicle she knew the dealership would be proud to sell. She stood near it with the calm focus of a serious buyer. She let time pass, long enough that any reasonable business would have approached her out of self-interest. Still no one came. Finally, she moved toward one of the consultants who appeared least occupied. Her approach was measured, polite, and simple. She did not demand attention. She did not interrupt aggressively. She merely positioned herself as someone ready to speak about the car in front of her. The consultant's face held something that might have been a professional expression, but it was strained, as if forced. His eyes did not carry warmth or openness. His body angled away slightly, keeping distance. Rhonda felt the unspoken resistance, the refusal disguised as courtesy. She stayed calm. She was careful, even now, not to give them the satisfaction of reaction. She indicated through her posture and attention that she wanted to learn more, that she wanted to take a car for a test drive, that she was prepared to move toward an actual purchase decision. It was an ordinary request in an ordinary customer's journey. In this room, with her standing where she stood and dressed the way she was dressed, it became a trigger. The consultant's response was not immediate rejection, but it carried the shape of one. His attention flicked to her clothes again, to her hands, to her face, as if searching for proof of something. His eyes moved toward the counter and then toward the back offices. He did not step closer to begin a standard process. Instead, he paused as though considering what protocol allowed him to do with her. The tension in his posture suggested that he was not deciding how to serve her, but whether to let her remain in the building. Rhonda observed it all, the hesitation that revealed its own judgment. She felt a familiar sensation, the kind she had known in other environments where people had made assumptions about her for different reasons. The tightness in the room was now directed. It had a target, and she was it. She watched the consultant step away slightly, not with the casual movement of someone fetching paperwork, but with the cautious withdrawal of someone seeking reinforcement. His gaze briefly met that of another employee, and there was an exchange so quick it could have been missed if she had not been paying attention. The other employee's expression changed. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then turned and walked toward the back, toward the manager's office. Rhonda remained in place, keeping her face neutral, her posture calm. She did not follow. She did not protest. She did not show anxiety. She simply waited, as if waiting were the most natural thing in the world. The waiting, she understood, was part of the trap. If she left, they would say she was never serious. If she stayed too long, they would say she was loitering. If she grew frustrated, they would say she was aggressive. The space was designed to allow them to be right, no matter what she did. As she stood there, she noticed the way the room's attention subtly reoriented around her. A consultant, who had been speaking animatedly to a customer, lowered his voice, his eyes sliding toward her, before returning to the conversation. Another staff member shifted position closer to the entrance, as if preparing for something. A man near the door, dressed like security, turned his head slightly in her direction. His face was blank, but his body language suggested readiness. He was not there to provide comfort. He was there to remove problems. Rhonda could feel herself being transformed in their minds. In the beginning, she had been invisible. Now she was becoming visible in the worst way. The dealership had made a decision to treat her not as a potential buyer, but as an inconvenience, a disruption to the atmosphere they sold along with the cars. Her calmness did not soften them. It unsettled them. It deprived them of the excuse they wanted, so they began to manufacture one. A few minutes passed, heavy with anticipation. The consultant who had stepped away did not return with keys or paperwork. He returned with a different kind of attention in his eyes. He did not approach like a professional eager to close a sale. He approached like someone who had been given instructions. His movements were measured, his expression careful, and behind him, Rhonda saw more of the staff watching, openly now, no longer attempting to hide their interest. It had the feeling of a staged moment, as if they wanted witnesses to what would happen next. Rhonda stayed calm, but her awareness sharpened. She noticed where the security stood, how he positioned himself not far from the path to the exit. She noticed the way the consultant's shoulders were squared, as though preparing to hold his ground. She noticed the slight tightening around the eyes of a woman at the counter, an expression that suggested annoyance rather than concern. None of them looked like people about to help a customer. They looked like people about to manage a situation. This was what she had come to see, not merely rude service, but the mechanism that turned an ordinary person into a problem. It was not just neglect anymore. It was an active process of labeling, of shaping perception, so that whatever they did next would appear justified. The most unsettling part was how normal it seemed to them, how routine. Rhonda felt the weight of it settle into her chest, a quiet heaviness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with understanding. If she were not who she was, if she had no name that could return later with power, this moment would be the beginning of a humiliation she could not correct. She would be ushered out with polite words that concealed contempt, and she would leave carrying the burden of blame for a conflict she did not create. The story would end there, quietly, as it had ended for so many others. But for her, it would not end there. She could sense the next move approaching, the moment when a manager would be involved, when security would be called in, not as a last resort, but as an instrument, when the dealership would decide to remove her rather than serve her. The air felt tighter now, as if the building itself had taken a breath and was holding it. Rhonda remained still at the center of their attention, calm enough to be misinterpreted as weakness, steady enough to make their cruelty feel safer. At the back of the showroom, a door opened briefly, and a figure moved inside, unseen except for the hint of authority in the way staff shifted their posture. Someone was being informed. Someone was preparing to step into the story they had already begun writing. Rhonda stood where she was, her face composed, her hands relaxed, her body language flawless. And as the security guard's gaze fixed on her with more focus than before, she understood that the dealership was no longer deciding whether to help her. It was deciding how to remove her. The shift did not announce itself with sound. It arrived as a tightening, a subtle rearrangement of bodies and attention, the kind of collective movement that happens when a room silently agrees on what must be done. Rhonda felt it before she fully saw it. The consultant who had withdrawn returned with a different posture, shoulders squared, expression neutral in a way that no longer suggested uncertainty. Behind him, the ambient rhythm of the showroom slowed, conversations dropping in volume as eyes began to linger without apology. The place had decided to act. The manager appeared from the back office with the ease of someone stepping into familiar territory. He was not hurried. There was no urgency in his stride, no confusion in his face. He wore the expression of a man who believed he was about to correct a minor inconvenience, not create a significant problem. His presence alone altered the behavior of the staff. Spines straightened. Movements became more deliberate. The atmosphere took on the weight of authority, and with it came the unspoken assumption that whatever followed would be justified by his position. He stopped a measured distance from Ronda, close enough to claim engagement but far enough to maintain control. His eyes moved over her quickly, not in curiosity but in assessment, as if confirming a conclusion already reached. When he spoke, his tone was calm and firm, carefully shaped to sound reasonable to anyone listening nearby. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being believed. From the beginning, he framed the situation as a response rather than an initiation. His posture, his stance, even the slight inclination of his head suggested patience being tested. He implied that there had been concerns, that staff had felt uncomfortable, that the smooth operation of the showroom had been disrupted. He did not accuse directly at first. Instead, he asked questions that carried their own answers, questions designed not to understand, but to confirm the narrative forming around her. Ronda listened without interrupting. She recognized the technique immediately. By speaking calmly and slowly, the manager positioned himself as the rational party. By implying disturbance without naming specifics, he left space for imagination to fill the gaps. It was a familiar strategy, one that relied on suggestion rather than evidence. The danger of it lay in how easily it spread. A single statement about discomfort could justify any subsequent action. She responded with the same restraint she had maintained since entering the building. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue emotionally. She asked for clarification, for specifics, for the rules she was allegedly violating. She asked what policy she had broken, what behavior had prompted concern, what steps were required to proceed with a legitimate inquiry about a vehicle. Her words were measured and clear, chosen carefully to keep the conversation grounded in facts. The manager's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Calm questions are difficult to dismiss without revealing intention. He answered vaguely, referring to general policies, to the need for a respectful environment, to the discretion of staff when dealing with unusual situations. Each response avoided precision. Each one shifted the focus away from concrete actions and toward impressions. It was no longer about what Ronda had done. It was about how she made others feel. Around them, the staff listened closely. The consultant who had first withdrawn stood nearby, his gaze fixed on the manager, ready to support whatever direction was set. Another employee leaned slightly forward, his expression attentive in a way that suggested eagerness to contribute. The collective attention felt rehearsed, as if they had all been waiting for permission to speak. That permission came quietly. One of the consultants added a comment, carefully phrased to sound helpful. He mentioned that Ronda had been lingering near the vehicles for an extended period. Another added that she had asked questions that seemed inconsistent with genuine purchasing intent. A third implied that she might have been recording or gathering information, though no device had ever been visible. Each contribution was small, almost polite, but together they formed a mosaic of suspicion. None of it was provable. None of it needed to be. The power of the story lay in its accumulation. Ronda felt the weight of it pressing in from all sides. The story was being built around her, not with outright lies, but with selective framing. Moments of patience were reinterpreted as loitering. Calm observation became suspicious behavior. Ordinary questions were reframed as provocation. She realized then that the outcome had been decided long before the manager approached her. His role was not to investigate. It was to formalize the conclusion. She attempted once more to steer the conversation back to procedure. She asked to see the written guidelines that govern customer interactions. She asked to submit a formal request for a test drive. She asked for documentation of the concerns raised against her. Each request was reasonable. Each one was met with resistance, disguised as explanation. The manager spoke of discretion, of internal assessments, of the need to maintain a certain standard. He emphasized the reputation of the dealership, invoking it as both shield and weapon. The mention of reputation changed the tone subtly. It reframed the interaction not as a service failure, but as a defensive measure. By positioning the dealership as the potential victim, the manager shifted moral weight away from Ronda. Now, any insistence on her part could be interpreted as an attack. It was a clever move and an effective one. The staff responded instinctively, their posture aligned with the manager's authority, their expressions hardening just enough to communicate agreement. Rhonda noticed how quickly individual uncertainty disappeared when reinforced by hierarchy. The consultants who had avoided eye contact earlier now watched openly, their attention sharpened by the permission to judge. She remained composed, but inside her awareness expanded. This was not merely about her removal, it was about setting an example. The dealership needed to demonstrate control, to show that it could identify and eliminate perceived disruptions without hesitation. Her calmness, rather than protecting her, had made her a more interesting target. It challenged their assumption that only unruly behavior warranted exclusion. By remaining measured, she forced them to invent a different justification. The manager's questions became firmer, more pointed. He suggested that it might be best for everyone if she concluded her visit. He spoke of misunderstandings and misalignment, of expectations not being met. He framed departure as a solution, not a punishment. His language was carefully chosen to sound benevolent, even as it stripped her of agency. Rhonda understood what was happening. The conversation was no longer a dialogue. It was a performance. The manager was delivering lines meant for the ears of staff and clients alike, constructing a version of events that would make her exit appear reasonable. She saw how easily it worked. The clients nearby watched with curiosity, but no alarm. To them, this was simply a business handling an issue. She asked one final question, her voice steady, her tone neutral. She asked whether she was being formally asked to leave and on what grounds. The room seemed to pause. The manager hesitated, just long enough for the moment to stretch. This was the point where intent became explicit. This was where the narrative either remained suggestion or transformed into action. He chose action. He stated that due to concerns raised by staff, her presence was no longer welcome. He spoke of maintaining a comfortable environment for other customers. He emphasized that this was a decision made in the interest of safety and professionalism. The words landed heavily, each one reinforcing the idea that she was the problem. Rhonda felt the quiet injustice of it settle into her chest. There was no anger yet, only clarity. She had not been loud. She had not been disruptive. She had not violated any rule, and yet she was now being officially labeled as a disturbance. The realization was sobering, not because it surprised her, but because of how easily it had happened. The manager signaled subtly, a small movement of his hand that most would not notice. The security guard responded immediately, stepping forward from his position near the entrance. His presence altered the atmosphere in an instant. He did not speak yet. He did not need to. His uniform and stance communicated the next phase clearly. Rhonda turned her attention to him briefly, then back to the manager. She did not plead. She did not argue. She stated calmly that she disagreed with the characterization of her behavior and that she had asked only for standard service. Her words were measured, recorded not by devices, but by memory, by the witnesses present, by the system she would later confront. The manager listened with a polite expression that did not reach his eyes. He responded with rehearsed empathy, acknowledging her perspective while dismissing its relevance. He reiterated the decision. He framed it as final. Around them, the staff's tension shifted into something closer to relief. The uncertainty was gone. The line had been drawn. They no longer had to wonder how to handle her. The system had provided an answer, and it was removal. Rhonda became acutely aware of how quickly a group could align itself against an individual when authority sanctioned the choice. No one spoke up. No one questioned the process. Even those who might have felt discomfort kept silent, their expressions neutral, their bodies angled away. The silence was not passive. It was cooperative. The security guard stepped closer, positioning himself just enough to guide her path without touching her yet. His body language was confident, assured of legitimacy. He had been given permission, and that permission transformed him from observer to enforcer. Rhonda felt the gravity of the moment. This was the point at which the story would be fixed in the minds of everyone watching. How she left would determine how she was remembered. She straightened slightly, maintaining her composure. She did not want them to have the satisfaction of seeing her diminished. As she prepared to move, she took in the scene one last time. The cars gleamed under controlled light. The staff stood in quiet formation, united by hierarchy. The manager watched with the certainty of someone who believed he had protected his domain. The clients observed with detached interest, already beginning to forget the details. Rhonda began to walk toward the exit under the guidance of the security guard. She felt the eyes on her back, the judgment solidifying behind her. She understood now how easily an ordinary visit could become an accusation, how smoothly a system could convert discomfort into guilt. And as the glass doors approached, she knew that what had begun as a test of service had become something far more revealing. This was no longer about being ignored. It was about being made guilty. The moment authority gives way to force is always quieter than people imagine. There is no dramatic shift, no sharp sound to announce it. It happens in posture, in proximity, in the way space is suddenly controlled. As Rhonda moved toward the exit, guided rather than escorted, she felt the invisible boundary close around her. The decision had already been made. What followed was merely its execution. The security guard positioned himself slightly ahead and to the side, not touching her yet, but close enough to dictate direction. His movements were practiced, efficient, and impersonal. This was not his first time doing this, and it showed. He walked at a pace that allowed no pause, steering her through the most visible path of the showroom. It was not the shortest route to the exit. It was the one that passed by the largest number of people. Rhonda noticed immediately. She understood the purpose. Removal was not enough. It had to be seen. The dealership needed witnesses, not for accountability, but for validation. If enough people observed her being let out, the assumption of guilt would become self-sustaining. No one would ask what had happened. They would assume that something must have justified it. As they moved, conversations nearby fell into uneasy silence. Some clients looked away quickly, uncomfortable but unwilling to involve themselves. Others watched openly, curiosity overtaking discretion. A few glanced at the staff, searching their expressions for cues on how to interpret the scene. The staff did not disappoint. Their faces were composed, their posture professional, their silence reinforcing the idea that this was a necessary intervention. The manager remained behind them, not following closely but close enough to maintain oversight. He did not need to speak anymore. His role was complete. The authority he represented had already transferred its weight to the uniform now guiding Rhonda's steps. She walked calmly, her shoulders straight, her pace steady. She did not resist, not because she agreed, but because she understood the trap. Any visible struggle would be reframed instantly as proof of aggression. Any raised voice would justify escalation. Calmness was the only defense left to her, even now. Still, she felt the sting of humiliation settle in her body, not as embarrassment, but as something heavier and colder. This was what it felt like to be removed from a space without having done anything wrong, to be made an example without explanation. As they neared the glass doors, Rhonda became aware of how the environment itself contributed to the moment. The transparency of the walls allowed passers-by outside to see in, their reflections merging with the figures inside. The exit was not just a boundary, it was a stage. The dealership had been designed to project openness, but now that openness worked against her, exposing her departure to anyone who happened to look. The doors opened automatically, releasing a breath of outside air that felt sharper than the climate-controlled interior. The security guard's hand moved closer to her arm, not quite making contact yet, but ready. The transition from inside to outside marked a subtle change in his demeanor. Inside, he had been restrained, professional, careful. Outside, the rules felt looser. Once beyond the threshold, the guard's grip became more assertive. His hand closed around her arm, not violently, but firmly enough to assert control. Rhonda felt the pressure and stopped for a fraction of a second, turning her head slightly to look at him. Her expression remained composed, but her eyes carried a warning born of awareness rather than threat. He ignored it. He guided her forward another step, his grip tightening just enough to communicate impatience. There were fewer witnesses here, fewer people whose opinions mattered to the dealership. The guard's posture shifted subtly, his shoulders squaring, his stance widening. This was no longer about escorting her out. It was about putting her in her place. Rhonda stumbled slightly as the guard pushed her forward more forcefully than necessary. It was not a dramatic fall, not yet, but it was enough to break her balance and draw attention. A couple standing near the entrance looked over, startled. The guard responded with a sharp movement, as if correcting her, rather than acknowledging his own excess. The implication was clear. If she fell, it would be because she was uncooperative. The humiliation reached its sharpest point there, in that moment of imbalance. Not because of the physical contact, but because of how easily it could be explained away. A report would later describe it as a misstep, a necessary correction, a reaction to resistance that had never occurred. Rhonda felt the injustice of it lodged deep inside her, heavier than anger, heavier even than shock. The guard pushed again, this time with less restraint. His foot moved forward as he applied pressure from behind, not enough to cause injury, but enough to force her out of the dealership's immediate area. The motion was quick, efficient, and degrading. Rhonda caught herself before falling fully, her hands brushing the ground as she regained her footing. The moment was brief, but its impact was not. For a split second, the world narrowed to sensation, the rough texture beneath her palm, the sound of her breath as she steadied herself, the awareness of eyes on her back. She straightened slowly, refusing to rush, refusing to appear rattled. When she turned slightly, she saw the guard watching her with an expression that held no remorse, only irritation that she had not fallen harder. Behind him, through the glass, the dealership continued as if nothing had happened. The cars remained pristine. The staff resumed their positions. The manager had already turned away. The incident, from their perspective, was complete. Rhonda stood there, her pulse steadying, her posture firm. She did not shout. She did not accuse. She did not demand explanations that would never come. Instead, she allowed the moment to settle fully, imprinting itself into her memory with exact clarity. She took note of the guard's face, the way he stood, the insignia on his uniform. She noted the time, the position of the sun, the angle of the entrance cameras. She did not need to record anything physically. She recorded it internally, with the precision of someone who understood the value of detail. The guard stepped back, satisfied that his task was complete. He gestured vaguely toward the street, an unmistakable signal to leave. His body language made it clear that any further presence would invite more force, less restrained than before. Rhonda met his gaze one last time, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and walked away from the dealership. With each step, the weight of what had happened became clearer. Inside, she had been ignored, judged, accused. Outside, she had been handled, pushed, and humiliated. And all of it had been done under the guise of professionalism, safety, and order. It was not the violence itself that unsettled her most. It was how easily it had been justified, how smoothly it had unfolded once authority decided she no longer belonged. As she reached the sidewalk and put distance between herself and the building, she felt the full significance of the moment settle in. If she had been anyone else, if she had lacked the resources and platforms she possessed, this would have been the end of the story. She would go home carrying the shame of an incident that was not her fault, with no recourse and no one to listen. The dealership would file its internal reports. The guard would continue his shifts, and nothing would change. But she was not anyone else. Rhonda paused briefly, looking back at the glass facade one last time. From the outside, it looked serene, almost inviting. Nothing in its appearance hinted at what had just occurred. That contrast hardened something inside her. The test she had come to conduct had delivered its result more clearly than she could have imagined. This was no longer a matter of poor service or individual misconduct. It was a system that functioned smoothly until challenged, then responded with force disguised as necessity. And she understood, with absolute certainty, that what happened next would not be impulsive or emotional. It would be deliberate. As she walked away, the dealership behind her resumed its quiet rhythm, unaware that the incident they believed resolved had only just reached its true beginning. The city did not change when Rhonda left the dealership behind, but she did. The distance between the glass facade and the street gave her just enough space to feel the moment settle into something solid and immovable. It was not rage that took shape inside her, nor the sharp desire to retaliate. It was clarity, the kind that comes when an experience refuses to be softened by interpretation or excuse. What had happened had been deliberate, procedural, and carefully framed to appear justified. That understanding stripped the event of ambiguity and replaced it with purpose. She did not rush away. She walked until the noise of the dealership faded into the background, until the tension in her shoulders eased just enough to think clearly. Every detail replayed itself with a precision she had learned to trust. The order in which people moved, the timing of the manager's appearance, the way the security guard's posture changed once they crossed the threshold. None of it felt spontaneous. It felt practiced. The more she examined it, the more certain she became that this was not an isolated incident, but a method. By the time she reached her car, she knew what she would do next, and just as importantly, how she would do it. The worst mistake in situations like this was haste. Anger invited errors, and errors diluted truth. She needed structure, not spectacle. The system that had tried to erase her would be confronted with a system stronger than itself, one built on documentation, process, and exposure. The first calls she made were quiet and direct. Legal counsel, not for drama, but for foundation. She described the events with precision, avoiding emotional language, focusing on sequence and action. Who spoke first? Who accused? Who escalated? Where physical contact occurred. The lawyers listened carefully, asking questions that mirrored her own internal review. What time was it? Where were the cameras? Was there signage regarding customer conduct? What security company employed the guard? Each question reinforced the same truth. This was not an argument over tone or misunderstanding. This was about conduct, authority, and misuse of power. Next came the decision to involve the public, but on her terms. She understood the risk of being framed as someone seeking attention or revenge. That narrative would be waiting, ready to be deployed. To counter it, the story had to be larger than her. It had to be about how systems treat people without status, not about how a famous person was mistreated. That meant evidence first, exposure second. She authorized formal requests for preservation of footage, knowing how easily digital records could disappear when not secured quickly. Notices were sent to the dealership and to the security company, making it clear that any alteration or deletion of relevant material would carry consequences. The language was firm, professional, and unmistakable. This was no longer a private dispute. It was a matter of record. Only then did she allow herself to return. The second approach to the dealership could not have been more different from the first. This time, there was no attempt at anonymity. She arrived with a small group, not imposing, but unmistakable in purpose. Legal representatives walked beside her, their presence signaling seriousness without theatrics. A pair of journalists waited nearby, careful not to intrude but ready to observe. The dealership's glass facade reflected them back with the same polished neutrality it had offered before. But the effect was different now. The building no longer felt imposing. It felt exposed. The reaction inside was immediate and unmistakable. Staff who had once looked through her now looked directly at her, recognition flashing across their faces with a mixture of shock and apprehension. The quiet confidence that had guided their earlier behavior dissolved into hurried movements and whispered exchanges. Someone stepped forward too quickly, then stopped, uncertain of what protocol now demanded. The atmosphere tightened, not with authority, but with fear. The manager appeared again, but this time his stride lacked its earlier ease. He recognized her instantly, and with that recognition came the collapse of the story he had constructed. The calm certainty in his expression faltered, replaced by calculation. He spoke with a politeness that bordered on urgency, attempting to reframe the encounter as a misunderstanding, a regrettable series of events that could be resolved quietly. Rhonda listened without interrupting, just as she had before. When he finished, she responded not with accusation, but with process. She stated her intention clearly. She was there to request immediate access to relevant records. She named the cameras whose footage she required. She requested copies of internal reports filed that day, including security logs and incident descriptions. She asked for the contract details of the security firm and the credentials of the guard involved. Each request was delivered calmly, each one narrowing the space for evasion. The manager attempted to slow the process, suggesting internal review, promising cooperation at a later date. The lawyers beside Rhonda intervened, reminding him of the formal notices already issued. The journalists, still quiet, took note of the shift in tone, the sudden emphasis on caution where earlier there had been none. The power dynamic had inverted, and it showed in every movement. As the requests were processed, cracks began to appear. A staff member hesitated when asked about report timelines. Another avoided eye contact when questioned about camera coverage near the entrance. The story the dealership had prepared no longer held together under scrutiny. The language of internal documents did not match the certainty with which accusations had been made. Phrases like "felt threatened" and "appeared suspicious" floated without anchors, unsupported by any recorded behavior. The footage, once secured, did the rest. It showed exactly what Ronda remembered: her patient movements, her distance from the vehicles, the absence of any disruptive behavior. The moment when the manager approached, the coordinated attention of the staff, the guards positioning before any resistance had occurred. Outside, the footage captured the shift clearly: the tightening grip, the push that required no justification except authority. The story the dealership had told itself could not survive contact with its own cameras. As journalists began to ask broader questions, the scope of the issue widened. This was no longer about one person's experience. Former customers came forward with similar accounts, stories of being dismissed, surveilled, escorted out for reasons that had never been clearly explained. A former employee, contacted quietly, described internal expectations about protecting the brand by filtering out those deemed unsuitable. The language was clinical, almost bureaucratic, and deeply revealing. The dealership attempted damage control, issuing statements that emphasized commitment to customer service and regret for any discomfort caused. The words sounded hollow against the weight of evidence. Insurance partners requested explanations. Corporate offices demanded reports. The security company distanced itself, framing the guards' actions as individual misconduct, only to be confronted with training materials that encouraged assertive removal of perceived threats. Ronda remained largely silent throughout the initial wave of attention. When she did speak, she spoke carefully, framing the issue as systemic rather than personal. She emphasized that her anonymity had been intentional, that she wanted to understand how an ordinary person might be treated. She spoke about dignity, about process, about the quiet harm caused by institutions that mistake discretion for righteousness. Her words were measured, and precisely because of that, they carried weight. Inside the dealership, the atmosphere changed from defensiveness to panic. Staff members who had once felt protected by hierarchy now feared becoming its casualties. Some cooperated fully, providing context and documentation. Others retreated into silence. The manager's authority eroded visibly as external oversight replaced internal control. By the end of the day, the incident could no longer be contained. It had escaped the walls of the showroom and entered the public record, where narratives are tested and reputations live or die by credibility. The dealership that had once dismissed a quiet woman as an inconvenience now faced questions it could not answer without unraveling itself. Ronda left the building again, but this time the departure carried no humiliation. The glass doors opened as they always had, but beyond them lay accountability instead of erasure. The truth, once invited in, did not need force to assert itself. It moved steadily, supported by evidence, indifferent to excuses. As she walked away, she knew the story was far from over. What had begun as an experiment in observation had become an examination of power, one that would reach far beyond a single showroom. The system had revealed itself, and now it would be required to respond. The return of truth had begun, and it would not be quiet. The first fracture appeared where the dealership least expected it, not in headlines or public statements, but in the quiet alignment of facts that refused to agree with one another. The internal report prepared by the manager spoke of disturbance and perceived threat, yet the timestamps conflicted with the moments captured by the cameras. Statements described urgency where footage showed patience. Claims of resistance stood beside images of stillness. Each discrepancy alone could have been explained away. Together they formed a pattern that could not. As the preserved recordings were reviewed by independent parties, the narrative that had once seemed so carefully constructed began to collapse under its own weight. The cameras had been everywhere the dealership claimed they were, and they had seen everything. They saw Ronda standing quietly near the vehicles, keeping her distance, waiting longer than any reasonable customer would be expected to wait. They saw the consultants pass her by again and again, choosing absence as their response. They saw the manager approach not as a mediator, but as an enforcer, his questions shaped to fit a conclusion already drawn. They saw the security guard position himself before any instruction to leave had been clearly stated. They saw the shift at the threshold, the moment professionalism gave way to force. The reports, when read alongside the footage, felt less like documentation and more like a performance. Words such as agitated, non-compliant, and suspicious floated through the text without anchoring themselves to visible behavior. They relied on interpretation rather than observation, implication rather than evidence. In rooms far removed from the showroom, lawyers and regulators marked these inconsistencies carefully, their pens tracing a story that no longer belonged to the dealership. The system responded as systems always do when exposed. It attempted to contain the damage by narrowing the scope. Statements emphasized that this was an isolated incident, the result of miscommunication and individual error. The security company issued its own clarification, distancing itself from the guard's actions, suggesting deviation from training and protocol. The dealership echoed this position, framing the guard as an unfortunate exception rather than a product of their environment. But the truth had already begun to expand beyond those walls. Former customers, emboldened by the visibility of the case, began to speak. Some did so publicly, others quietly, reaching out to journalists and legal teams with stories that mirrored Ronda's experience in unsettling ways. They described being ignored until frustration made them visible, then treated with suspicion rather than assistance. They recalled being asked to leave for reasons that were never clearly explained, escorted out with a firmness that felt disproportionate to any behavior they could recall. Individually, their stories had faded into memory. Together, they formed a chorus that challenged the idea of coincidence. Former employees added their voices, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence. They spoke of unspoken guidelines, of the pressure to maintain a certain image, of the expectation that not every person who walked through the door was a potential customer worth engaging. They described training sessions where emphasis was placed on protecting the atmosphere, on preventing disruption, on ensuring that the showroom reflected a particular standard. They spoke of discretion used not as judgment, but as exclusion. One former consultant, no longer bound by the fear of losing a job, described how management encouraged staff to trust their instincts about who belonged and who did not. The language was careful, always framed in terms of safety and brand integrity, but the effect was unmistakable. Another recalled the quiet relief that spread through the team when difficult visitors were removed, not because they posed danger, but because their presence challenged the illusion of exclusivity. As these accounts emerged, external institutions began to take interest. Regulatory bodies requested documentation related to customer conduct policies and security procedures. Licensing authorities examined the relationship between the dealership and its contracted security firm. Insurance partners, wary of liability, asked pointed questions about incident reporting and use of force. Each inquiry added pressure, and the dealership's ability to manage its own narrative weakened further. The security company attempted a more aggressive defense, portraying the guard as a rogue actor whose behavior violated explicit training. Yet training materials obtained during the investigation told a different story. They emphasized assertive control, rapid escalation when authority was questioned, and prioritization of perceived threat over dialogue. While not explicitly instructing physical force, they created an environment in which such force felt permissible, even expected, once a person was labeled problematic. Inside the dealership, the atmosphere changed from confusion to fear. Staff members who had once felt protected by hierarchy now worried about becoming its casualties. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Emails circulated with increasingly careful language. Some employees sought legal counsel of their own, anxious to distance themselves from decisions they had not made but had supported through silence. Others began to cooperate more openly, providing context and clarification that further undermined the official narrative. The manager, once so confident in his authority, found that authority eroding rapidly. He was questioned not only about this incident, but about patterns, practices, and past complaints that had been quietly resolved or dismissed. His explanations grew longer, more convoluted, less convincing. The certainty with which he had framed Ronda as a problem could not withstand the scrutiny of evidence that told a different story. Financial consequences followed swiftly. High-end clients, sensitive to reputation, reconsidered their associations. Corporate partners paused collaborations, unwilling to be linked to controversy. Marketing campaigns were pulled. Banks reviewed credit arrangements. The dealership's polished image, once its greatest asset, now amplified its vulnerability. Each new development compounded the sense that control was slipping away. The attempt to isolate blame failed completely when documents revealed that similar incidents had been handled in much the same way before, though without public attention. The system that had seemed so efficient in managing discomfort had been relying on obscurity. Once exposed to light, its methods appeared crude and indefensible. Throughout it all, Rhonda remained largely absent from the center of the storm. She allowed the process to unfold, resisting the temptation to comment on every development. When she did speak, it was to redirect attention away from herself and toward the mechanisms at work. She emphasized that what mattered was not her resilience, but the vulnerability of those without it. Her restraint contrasted sharply with the dealership's reactive posture, and the difference did not go unnoticed. The internal collapse accelerated as the possibility of closure became real. Discussions about suspending operations surfaced. Corporate oversight replaced local decision-making. The language of inevitability entered conversations that once revolved around damage control. For the first time, those responsible began to understand that this was not a problem to be managed, but a reckoning to be faced. The final reports assembled a comprehensive picture. They showed how authority had been used to justify exclusion, how force had been framed as protection, how narratives had been constructed to shift blame onto those least able to resist. The system had not broken because it was attacked from the outside. It broke because it was examined from within and found wanting. As the findings were prepared for release, the dealership's leadership confronted the reality that their version of events could no longer survive. Decisions that once felt minor now carried consequences they could not escape. The quiet confidence that had governed the showroom gave way to a collective understanding that accountability was unavoidable. The system had revealed its design, and in doing so, it had condemned itself. What remained was not a question of whether consequences would follow, but how far they would reach. The breaking point had passed. The only thing left was the fall. The end did not arrive with spectacle. There were no dramatic arrests at the showroom doors, no shouted confessions, no sudden collapse broadcast live for an audience hungry for resolution. Instead, the conclusion unfolded the way real consequences often do, through documents, decisions, signatures, and absences. Offices emptied. Names disappeared from organizational charts. Doors closed quietly, and when they reopened, they belonged to different people. The dealership issued its first official statement late, carefully worded and noticeably restrained. It spoke of internal reviews, of restructuring, of commitments to improvement. It avoided naming individuals, avoided acknowledging patterns, avoided the word responsibility. Yet the absence of denial said more than any admission could have. Those who followed the case closely understood that the language of the statement was not chosen by confidence, but by counsel. It was not an explanation, it was a concession. Within days, the manager who had once spoken with such certainty no longer represented the showroom. His departure was described as a mutual decision, a step taken in the interest of moving forward. The staff understood what that phrase meant. Authority, when exposed, retreats quietly. Others followed him out, some by choice, some by necessity. The security guard was suspended pending further proceedings, his future no longer protected by the ambiguity that had once shielded him. The security firm revised its public posture, distancing itself from practices it had previously defended. The physical space of the dealership changed as well. Operations were suspended under the pretense of reassessment. Vehicles were moved, signage was removed, and the once immaculate showroom stood dark behind its glass walls. For passers-by, it looked temporary. For those involved, it felt final. Reputation, once cracked, does not easily return to its former shape. Legal outcomes followed their own measured rhythm. Complaints turned into cases, cases turned into settlements and rulings. Financial penalties were imposed, not as punishment alone, but as acknowledgement of harm. The language of the law transformed lived experience into precedent, ensuring that what had happened would not vanish quietly into memory. Each document added weight to the record. making it harder for similar conduct to be dismissed elsewhere. For the dealership's corporate partners, the cost was not only financial, but symbolic. Contracts were terminated, associations were severed, public distance became necessary for survival. What had once been a prestigious name now carried an asterisk, a reminder that image without integrity invites scrutiny. In private meetings, executives spoke of lessons learned. In public, they spoke less. As the dust settled, attention turned inevitably to Ronda. There were expectations of triumph, of satisfaction, of victory declared. She offered none of it. When she addressed the outcome, she did so with a calm that unsettled those waiting for anger or celebration. She explained that the purpose of her anonymity had never been to provoke or expose for its own sake. It had been to experience the world as it treats those without recognition, without leverage, without protection. She spoke of how easily a person can be made into a problem, not through what they do, but through how they are perceived. She described the moment when patience becomes suspicion, when silence becomes guilt, when authority decides that exclusion is simpler than engagement. She emphasized that the most dangerous systems are not those that act openly, but those that believe themselves reasonable. The story resonated far beyond the confines of the dealership. Other businesses quietly revisited their policies. Training manuals were rewritten with different emphases. Security protocols were scrutinized, not for efficiency alone, but for proportionality and accountability. None of these changes were announced as responses to her case, yet the influence was clear. Awareness had entered spaces where complacency once lived. Privately, messages reached Ronda from people she had never met. Some described experiences eerily similar to hers, moments when they had been escorted out of places they believed they were entitled to occupy. Others spoke simply of recognition, of seeing their own quiet humiliations reflected and validated. She read them carefully, understanding that these voices represented the true weight of what had happened. Justice, she knew, was not measured only in consequences for the powerful, but in relief for those who had long believed they were alone. In the end, the dealership attempted to reemerge under altered branding and new leadership. Press releases announced change. Promises were made. Time would determine their sincerity. The original location, once a symbol of exclusivity, now stood as a cautionary reference point, its history inseparable from its architecture. For Ronda, the experience left no desire for further confrontation. What it left was resolve. She had entered the showroom seeking understanding and found something far more consequential. The test had revealed not just how a single business behaved, but how easily systems prioritize comfort over fairness when they believe no one is watching. She returned to her life without fanfare, carrying the memory not as a wound, but as a reminder. Power, she understood now more clearly than ever, does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it reveals itself in silence, in procedures followed without thought, in decisions justified by habit. Challenging it requires patience, evidence, and the willingness to let truth speak louder than force. The price of arrogance had been paid, not in spectacle, but in accountability. And while no ending can erase what had occurred, this one ensured that it would not be forgotten. The story did not conclude with applause. It ended with something rarer and more enduring: consequence. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Watch more stories like this on the channel and share this video with someone who needs to see it.